My name is Bob Greenspan. I chair the board of the Nantucket Atheneum. I want to welcome you to the third of our wonderful Geschke lecture series, made possible by grants from the National Endowment of the Humanities and Chuck and Nan Geschke's Foundation, and by contributions from many of you. As you know, the Atheneum, although the island's public library needs to raise 2/3 of its operating budget each year privately, and we're able to do that through the generosity of our sponsors and friends, and that enables us to put on programs like this tonight. So we thank you very much for that. Now, we're in store for a great evening. When many of you think of Joe Klein, I suspect that what comes to mind is Joe's work for Time magazine, or when he wrote the wonderful Letters from Washington for the New Yorker, or perhaps you've seen him on his many appearances on television. And I think we all think of immediately the 1996 book called Primary Colors, in which Joe, as anonymous, wrote very insightfully and wonderfully about Bill Clinton's first campaign in 1992. When I think of Joe Klein, I have a different recollection. I think of Joe as a charter member of a golf group that gets together each year in Palm Springs in January. We always stay at the same hotel, a 1947 reproduced 1947 hotel right downtown called the Del Marco. And we play a few rounds of golf, and we always go to dinner one night at Johnny Costa's, which was reputedly Frank Sinatra's favorite restaurant. And as you would expect, we order the signature dish, which you might not be surprised, is called Steak Sinatra. And with Steak Sinatra, you get a side of spaghetti. So it's very old school. The best thing about our little golf group is that after dinner, we go back to the Dell and we sit around the fire pit there and share stories. Now, most of the group are veterans of the television business, mostly cable TV, HBO, Showtime, the Playboy Channel, Fox, and as you would expect, these guys are generally great storytellers. I'm not sure everything they tell us is true, but they're fun stories, and I've learned a lot about Hugh Hefner that I can't share with you tonight. I'm the only lawyer in the group. It's my privilege to be allowed to join in the group's discussions, but they don't allow me to say anything. Now, I mention all of this because in this group of really good storytellers, one of us has always stood out, and that is our speaker tonight. Joe has literally been everywhere. He literally knows everyone. He's lived this wonderful life of being able to follow his curiosity wherever it takes him. He's been interested in politics for a long time. We've all benefited from that. But I think at our last outing, Joe was talking to us about he had been as an embedded journalist in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was a very significant experience for him. And he started to get interested in into the intersection of military leadership and politics. And I suspect that we might hear something about that tonight. I'd like us all to welcome tonight's Geschke speaker, Joe Klein.
Just at the outset, he didn't learn anything about Hugh Hefner from me. And I hope it's okay with you guys. I'm going to take off my jacket. I've had this arduous sea voyage over from my house in Cape Cod today, and I really want to be able to relax. So I'll have some brief remarks, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. Don't you love it when politicians say that? I mean, how many questions do they ever take, right? But I actually, when I do these kind of things, especially with a crowd as erudite as this one, I'm really interested in your questions because they drive my reporting and columnizing and sometimes my bookmaking, not bookmaking, that's being a bookie, book writing. And actually, I'll even start the Q&A with two questions that will inevitably come up, and we'll just get them out of the way right away. Joe, what's going to happen in the 2014 elections, and who are going to be the candidates in 2016? Well, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen in 2014. And I have real insights into who the candidates are going to be in 2016. How many of you, let's have a show of hands, how many of you actually believe that? Nobody. Nobody should. I mean, we journalists are really good at things that have already happened. If they happened a year ago or 2 years ago and we put a team of really great young reporters on it, we get some good stuff. And we're pretty good on things that are happening now. Not all of us, but there are many who can go to a place like Gaza or Iraq or Capitol Hill and figure it out and report it to you. But we just suck at making predictions, and that's what they always want us to do on TV, and it's just an embarrassment. I stopped making predictions a long time ago, and so you're not going to get any from me tonight, but you can ask. I mean, I'll tell you what I think about Hillary Clinton, but that'll be later. Mostly, I want to talk to you about things that I learned over the last 12 years. The other inevitable question is, what did the Clintons think about primary colors? And I can tell you that. At the end of his presidency, I was at the New Yorker, and I decided to do this really radical thing. And because I was at the New Yorker, I could spend a whole year doing it. I was going to find out what he had actually accomplished as president in between all of those scandals. I mean, my colleagues had spent 8 years obsessed with nonsense. And I wondered whether in the midst of all that, Clinton had done anything. And so I started interviewing people at the middle level of his administration. And very soon he heard about it. And he came up to me at a White House event and he said, "Joe, I know what you're doing." He says, "I want to be part of it." And so we had a series of very long interviews that became a very long piece in the New Yorker and then became my book, The Natural. And after the first session we had was a couple of hours on welfare and healthcare reform. And I'll confess it up front, I'm a wonk. I could bore you to tears on any number of policy issues, which I'll try not to do tonight, but, and so is he. And we had a great old time talking about the intricacies of healthcare and whether he should have done welfare reform first to build the public support that he needed to get healthcare passed. It was really kind of exhilarating. And at the end of it, we sat back and we were having a couple of Diet Cokes, and Hillary came in. And we're having this lovely conversation, and all of a sudden, she and I are, and all of a sudden, from my left shoulder, I hear, "So, Joe, why'd you write that book anyway?" And I said, well, and this is actually the God's honest truth, I saw primary colors as a tribute to larger-than-life politicians. And at which point, the First Lady snorted derisively. And I said, well, First Lady, would you rather have a larger-than-life president or a smaller-than-life president? And she shrugged in acquiescence because at that point she was looking at two people, at one guy she disdained, George W. Bush, and another guy she despised, Al Gore, as the next president of the United States. And I said, larger-than-life politicians, larger-than-life people have larger-than-life strengths and larger-than-life weaknesses. And she looked at at me, and then she looked at him and she started to laugh. She belly laughs. It's one of the most wonderful things. You'll never see it, but she does. And she said, larger-than-life strengths and larger-than-life weaknesses? That's for sure. That, I thought, was the end of my career as a political journalist. I had covered seven presidential campaigns. The 2000 campaign was unutterably boring until it ended, when it became kind of interesting, if you remember. But I didn't want to do it again. I wanted to go home and write more novels and turn my Clinton reporting into a book. And, you know, I had been doing it at that point about 30 years. And I had watched something that I loved very much, the American political process, kind of go down the tubes. You know, a friend of mine, Adam Walensky, who was one of Bobby Kennedy's top aides, used to say to me, television has ruined everything. And he was talking about NBA basketball. But when you think about it, our current era began in 1960, when debates were televised for the first time. And many of you, I'm sure, know that people who listened to those debates on radio thought Richard Nixon had cleaned Kennedy's clock. People who watched those debates saw a very suave and cool John Kennedy and a Nixon with a 5 o'clock shadow and you know, sweating above his, you know, above his mouth, and looking kind of skeevy and dark. And after that, any politician in the country worth his, or not too many hers in those days, more, thank God now, worth their salt, said, get me someone who can tell me how to do television. And it was the birth of the era of political consulting. And these consultants said, hey, we can not only tell you how to act on TV, but we can tell you how to present yourself in advertisements on TV. They picked this up real fast. But to do that, they had to raise a lot more money to get on TV. And then, you know, the consultants came back and they said, look, you know, we would have a much better sense of what the public wanted if we could start doing these things called focus groups that they do in commercial advertising. You know, we'll tell you what, you know, the very words that you can say that will actually work. They love that too. And by 1976, the first presidential campaign that I covered, God help me, this is going to be my 11th. They don't have 12-step programs for political junkies. But by 1976, Jimmy Carter's 29-year-old pollster, after he won the election, Pat Caddell, sent Carter a memo saying, if you want to govern successfully, you're going to have to govern as if it is a permanent campaign. And it has been pretty much downhill ever since. You know, I came into politics the spring of my senior year. Met someone in the crowd tonight who was at the University of Pennsylvania with me. And on the night of April 4th, when Martin Luther King died, Bobby Kennedy was supposed to speak in Indianapolis, in the ghetto. And the police chief there, a man named Winston Churchill, said to him, don't go in there. We're not going to be able to protect you. They were putting all the cops in to protect white neighborhoods. But Kennedy went in there. Adam Walensky, who I just mentioned, wrote some notes for him, wrote a speech. Kennedy said, nope, don't want it. And he went in, and this was before cell phones, obviously, and they hadn't heard that Martin Luther King was killed. And so this white boy had to tell him. And you can watch this speech. It's only 5 minutes long. You can watch it on YouTube. And you hear when he tells them something terrible has happened, Martin Luther King was killed. There are wails and cries and just the worst sort of anguish. And then he begins to talk to them quietly about how King was a man of peace, not of violence, of love, not of war. And then, for the first time publicly since his brother's assassination, he mentions the fact that he had lost someone in his family. And then he does something that you will never see an American politician do now. In front of this infuriated, impoverished, ill-educated audience, he quoted Aeschylus about the pain that falls drop by drop upon the heart until wisdom comes through the awful grace of God. And then he was gone. And almost every city in the country blew up that night, as you probably remember. I see a lot of gray hair out in this audience. But Indianapolis did not. And by 2000, when I was ready to quit politics, I realized that something like that Bobby Kennedy event probably would never happen in American politics again. I mean, his consultants would all be all over him saying, no, you can't go in there. What do you know, they're going to riot. It's going to be terrible, and quote Aeschylus, Esca who? Come on, we'll give you some focus group, pablum about race relations. That, if you need to go in, we'll give you that. You go out around the country as I do. I take these road trips every summer. I'm going to take one in September that are crowdsourced. We go on Morning Joe or, some other program and ask people to put together groups. Last time I did 40 groups in 20 days on a tour from through the battleground states in 2012. And you go through and you talk to people, and they know what political language sounds like. And in fact, they've begun to speak it themselves. The most depressing thing is that I can interview a civilian and know within a minute whether they watch Fox or MSNBC. So I'd had it. I was done. And I went back to start writing a novel and also write my Clinton book. I was tired. I quit The New Yorker. I mean, the guy in the office next to me was Phil Hamburger, who was a neighbor of mine on the Cape, who was 78 years old. You don't quit The New Yorker. You just, kind of molder there in your office and write exquisite things every 6 months or so. But I quit, and I retired. My retirement lasted for 9 months and 10 days. On the 11th day of the 9th month, my son, who was a diplomat and was at the UN at the time, said, "Dad, turn on the TV." And of course, you know what was happening. It was 9/11. And we were living in a small town just north of New York City at the time. And 9 of our neighbors didn't come home that night. And a remarkable thing happened. We became citizens again. We heard, and the forces of social capital in the town, which is of course a euphemism for the women, they set up a calendar to feed the 9 families for the next month. And then we heard that they needed gloves and shovels down at Ground Zero. And my wife and others, I was working the phones and doing whatever retired journalists pretend to do. They went to Home Depot and bought the place out and brought all the shovels and gloves to the Pelham Fire Station. And then came the memorial services. And there was this one widow, and we were all together. We were really neighbors. We were really a community for a moment. And this one widow, whose husband was an investment banker, whom I never had particularly been my cup of tea, was holding this little baby in her arms, and she said, "I got this one and a 2-year-old. Joe, you do this for a living. When they get old enough to ask questions, will you tell them why their father died?" So I didn't need much prodding to unretire at that point. And on September 12th, the editor of The New Yorker called me up and said, "Where do you want to go? What country do you want to go to?" I said, "Iran, but that's not the right question." He said, "What's the right question?" I said, "The right question is, how is the American military, which was built to fight tank battles on the plains of Europe and then kind of transferred that to the plains of Iraq for the first Gulf War, how are they going to deal with a stateless, ephemeral enemy?" He said, "Okay, go do that, and then go to Iran." And my life has been pretty much doing that and going to Iran ever since. A couple of years into this, places like Iran, I should say, a couple of years into this, I realized that as a New Yorker writer, I was denied certain body parts, like elbows. And it seemed that the President of the United States was going to go to war in a country that wasn't a country without knowing the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite. And I got an offer from Time magazine to have a weekly column where I could use my elbows. And so I did another thing that people do. I left the New Yorker and went to work for Time magazine. Now, my life has been, I graduated from Penn in 1968, a redolent year. And I've gotten my education ever since. When they stopped trying to do it to me, I started doing it for myself. And I've been lucky to have great mentors along the way. My dear friend Tim Russert, who was part of this community, hooked me up with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who taught me race, poverty, the inner city, beginnings of economics. Richard Holbrook, also gone, began to teach me diplomacy, teach me the world. And now I needed to learn a whole new set of stuff. I knew the region some. I've been going to Israel, once a year for wars and elections ever since 1979. I'd been to some of the other countries in the region, but I really wanted to double down on the place. I'd written about American veterans, Vietnam veterans, but I'd written from the bottom up, a book called Payback about grunts. And now I wanted to learn military theory from the top down. I wanted to learn Islam. I wanted to learn the U.S. intelligence community. And Jim Kelly, the editor of Time, said, "Okay, you could do all that as long as you don't go 2 blocks away from the White House." I said, "Well, occasionally I can go out there, right?" And he said, "Yeah, occasionally, but you got to give us primo political reporting." Well, the war in Iraq turned out to be the disaster that every major military figure of that generation, with the exception of Tommy Franks, thought it was going to be. And after we were there, most of these people who didn't want to have any part of Iraq had the sense of honor that we couldn't just leave it. We had to provide some sort of stability before we left, even though they were not particularly optimistic about long-term success. And I wrote a column around 2006 about this thing called counterinsurgency warfare, which was a reversal of the old way we made war, Old way was you went out and you played whack-a-mole. You went after the bad guys and you killed them. Counterinsurgency warfare was the opposite. You protected the civilians and hoped that if you could build their trust, they would tell you where the bad guys were. That seemed pretty interesting to me, and I wrote a column about it. And the next day, I got a phone call from General David Petraeus, who had been cast into the outer darkness by Donald Rumsfeld, perhaps the single worst public servant of my lifetime. He thought he was sending Petraeus to the end of the earth at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which happens to be the Army's think tank, and also school for majors. Majors were taught strategy, tactics, logistics, the big three. Petraeus added two more, counterinsurgency and Islamic culture. And if you really wanted to do well, you could take an elective in either Arabic or Pashto using Rosetta Stone. At the same time, Petraeus transformed the training of the Army from saluting and charging the hill to learning how to make moral decisions under fire on the basis of incomplete information. Learning how to think. Learning how to be community police officers, in effect. And so he said, look, you don't know anything. Why don't you come out here and study with us? We're doing this counterinsurgency manual. And I said, I will. He said, there is a reading list. And he sent me 30 scholarly articles from military journals about counterinsurgency. Now, you know, I was an Ivy League graduate, lesser Ivy, from the liberal arts from the 60s, and I had a certain way that I read scholarly articles. Here and there, a little bit here, a little bit there, and oh yes, I could talk my way through a bit of counterinsurgency when I got there. So I get there, and every night we get together, Petraeus and his circle of colonels, and who are military intellectuals, Rhodes Scholars, first in their class at West Point, and trained killers besides. The most intellectually rigorous group I had come across in 40 years of journalism. It was unbelievable. And the rules were I could ask anything, but they would call me on it if there was something I should have known that I didn't. Klein, didn't you read Corelli's piece on full spectrum warfare? It was on the list. Klein, you're so lazy, one of them said, looking at my loafers. You don't even tie your shoes in the morning. Had me there. Well, I really love learning stuff. It's the reason why I still do journalism. And I was learning an awful lot from them. And by the way, I'll tell you one quick Hillary Clinton story. One day I'm in Petraeus' office there, and I said to him, I was about to leave actually, and I asked him, is there anybody who could be president on the Democratic side who has even the vaguest idea of how your mind works? And he said, you mean aside from Hillary? So I had to go out when he got the job in Iraq. I had to see it. I had to see what was going on. I had to break a written agreement with my wife that I had signed 30 years earlier after I had done something particularly stupid in Nicaragua. I had only broken it a couple of times in the past when she wasn't looking, but I went and embedded in Iraq. And I was blown away by the kids. And they were kids, 30-year-old captains running companies of 200 people, making these decisions under fire, trying to provide services to the locals. I became addicted. People do. I started going to Afghanistan. I went 4 times and embedded with the troops. I went to one place down in Kandahar province in the south, one town, again and again and again. The town was called Sanjare. It was 2 towns away from Mullah Omar's hometown, and it was 80% Taliban control when I first got there. And at the ripe old age of 60-something, I was out there weighing as much as I do. And I must say that I am not a fitness nut. Wearing body armor, walking outside the wire on patrol with these kids, but also watching them crowdsource the town and ask them, for the first time in human history, what do you want? We got money for public works projects. What do you want? And the people told them that the Canadians had built this school, that the Taliban had booby-trapped and shut down, and they wanted the school reopened. That's what they really wanted. So the captain of this company had to take that to the local Shura. And the local Shura had their ideas about how they wanted the money spent. They wanted us to build this irrigation ditch out to some lands that they had 12 miles west of town. It was in the Arghandab River Valley. There was water, there was irrigation. They wanted us to do that so that they could plant poppies and give half the crop to the Taliban. This young captain decided that that just wasn't going to work, and that he went back to plan A, which was the school. He wanted to give them a little bit of the money, the elders, to buy them off, and he figured out some ways to do that. And one day I'm out on patrol with him, and the school's about to open, and he's looking for an overwatch place near the school, which was just on the edge of town, in between Taliban country and the town itself. And he knocks on this door. It's local landholders. The young guy was the representative of the local landholders. And he walks in, takes off his helmet, puts aside his rifle, gets down on the ground, sitting Indian style, drinking tea, smiling but not too much, body language really terrific. And he starts negotiating with this guy to let the United States Army use his roof to watch the school the night before we were going to go in and try and clean it out, to see if the Taliban were coming in overnight. And in the midst of this, I had this blinding insight. His name was Jeremiah Ellis. He came from Iowa. And I said, if this kid can do this here, under fire, dealing with 6 different bureaucracies, 3 on our side, 3 on their side, he can go back home and run for office. I realized that these kids had been trained, and Petraeus will tell you that this is his greatest achievement as a soldier. They had been trained to govern. They had been trained to do public works. They had been trained to lead. And so I decided, with the help of, shockingly, both Petraeus and Paula Broadwell, and other people I know, Paul Rykoff from Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, I decided to start traveling around the country and meeting the kids who were coming home and seeing what they were doing. And that's what I've been doing. And that's what my next book is about. It's specifically about 2 guys who formed public service organizations, both of whom are going to run for office someday soon. You may have heard of the public service organizations. They are the Mission Continues, which gives 6-month public service fellowships to wounded veterans, and Team Rubicon, which does disaster relief. 350, Team Rubicon is all enlisted people, 350 non-coms organized 10,000 citizens in New York to clean up the Rockaways after Sandy. I've been out on deployments with these kids, and it is something, it touches your heart. It moves you. Now, I know that the public image of these kids is that they're a bunch of basket cases. You know, welcome home, thank you for your service, I'd love to hire you, but I'm not going to because you're going to shoot up my office. The last part is usually not said, I must admit. That's the public impression. And a lot of that is true. You know, they suffered, an awful lot of people suffered an awful lot of wounds that would have killed them in other wars, especially traumatic brain injuries, that because of the brilliant quality of field medicine, they survived. But in addition to that, they also came home because they were a generation of volunteers. A lot of them volunteered right after 9/11. They also came home with a desire to serve. The surveys show that 90% of them say that they want to serve in their communities when they come home. And I watched the two organizations make that happen. And Mission Continues especially was very, very precise about keeping track of their fellows, the people who did these 6-month public service efforts. And a team of sociologists from Washington University in St. Louis, Mission Continues is based in St. Louis, followed it. And what we have begun to find is that the act of serving others is a really wonderful way to treat post-traumatic stress. You know, it's a way, you know, I know this wonderful Marine sergeant, a woman who lives up in Lowell, who said that after she came home, she was part of one of those bomb disposal units like Hurt Locker, and she lost a lot of friends. And she said, when I came home, I deployed myself to Camp Couch, where I was the commanding officer, and my duty was to stay on Camp Couch until further notice. And it took some friends to pry her off Camp Couch and get her out into the community and start helping other people, and she became a real leader. Now, when you think about that, this shouldn't be too surprising, because returning veterans have something in common with another part of our society that has been studied up the wazoo, the elderly. There is all this academic literature that will tell you that if the elderly go out into the community and do public service, they're happier, they live longer. And when you think about the elderly, what do they have? A lot of them have disabilities that come with age. A lot of them have lost loved ones and feel isolated from the community. A lot of them know that they're not what they used to be and are kind of ashamed to go out. Sounds an awful lot like a bunch of veterans to me. But there was another realization that I made that brings this talk to full circle. And that's this. These kids in the military were among the last communitarians we had in the country. The religious community is communitarian for sure, but they were people who believed that it was important to be part of something larger than themselves. They were people who believed who suffered if they didn't have a life of purpose, if there wasn't something important for them to do tomorrow. They were people who loved the men and women they served with and mourned those who lost and felt they had need to take care of those who were wounded. Interesting values, kind of like being in my suburb the day after 9/11. And very much at variance with what's happened in our society over the last 60 years or so since the end of World War II. I named a character in Primary Colors after this phenomenon. Machiavelli said that Ozio was the greatest enemy of a republic. What's Ozio? By the way, I named the governor of New York Orlando Ozio because I knew he knew Italian and it would really piss him off. Ozio is indolence. What Machiavelli was concerned about was what would happen to a republic when it wasn't at war. Would it lose its coherence? Would people get lazy? And I would argue to you that we have had the greatest experiment in Ozio in the history of the world during the years that essentially encompass my lifetime. I was born in 1946. And over that time, as I covered politics, people tuned out. And I couldn't blame them. There were some elections, 1988. Who would care who won? Didn't make all that much difference. Turned out that the better man did win, and the guy who enacted and promulgated the best foreign policy in my lifetime, George H.W. Bush, and also did a couple of other kind of right-wing things like starting cap and trade for acid rain and proposing charter schools and other kinds of really conservative things. But, in 1988, I would go out and people would say, I'm not going to vote. Or people would say what my brother says. I don't vote, it just encourages them. And I could understand that. Politics was a dark little cloud on the edge of the eternal American sun. And during that time, we lost the habits of citizenship. Interesting thing to me about a lot of especially the officer class of people who I've been, of people I've been dealing with, is that a lot of them were classics majors. One of them, who's running for Congress up on the North Shore of Massachusetts, Seth Moulton, was a physics and philosophy major at Harvard and one of the commencement speakers in May of 2001, before 9/11. And he used the occasion to announce that he was joining the Marine Corps because he felt it was his civic duty. His mother was a great old stone New England liberal, and she was quoted in the Boston Globe the next day as saying, "I would have only been more disappointed if Seth had announced he was pursuing a life of crime." But Seth had a sense, and Eric Greitens, the guy who started The Mission Continues, had a sense of citizenship that was very different from the rest of ours. They believed that citizenship meant that you are actively involved in your community. Citizenship meant that you served. Doesn't have to be the military, and in this country it's never going to be universal, but Teach for America is only in the poorest neighborhoods. We can use Teach for America in a lot of other neighborhoods as well. The act of serving makes you part of a community, makes you understand what a community is all about, makes you value the democracy that we have that seems to be becoming a circus before our very eyes. And so, I'll answer another question in closing. How do we get rid of this paralysis and this mess in Washington? Can we do something about campaign finance reform and all these other things that are gumming up the system? And the answer to that question is no, can't. Not in any easy way. The only way you can get rid of it is by having an active citizenry, people who actually care about things, people who take an interest. I don't know how we get there, but I'm weirdly optimistic. First of all, because I really love this country. I've traveled all over the world. And when you go to places in other countries, you know that the longest line in town is always the line at the American embassy or consulate of people who want visas to come here. We have something really wonderful here that we're kind of blowing because of Ozio, because of our laziness. Now, I know you guys aren't lazy. You're great citizens. You wouldn't be here if you weren't great citizens. And I also know that a good part of the problem has been created by people like me. Not me specifically, because I cover issues and do stuff like that, but journalism has gone through a tremendous change in my lifetime. When I was starting out as a journalist, the fundamental value that journalists should have was skepticism. You questioned everything. That was really healthy. But along about Watergate, when journalists began to think, hey, I could get famous and rich and take people down, that began to change. And skepticism slid into cynicism. I have an aphorism, which is, cynicism is what passes for insight among the mediocre. And too much of what we see on TV, too much of what we read, those few remaining readers among us, is cynical. The toughest article and I try and work on this with the kids who come to Time magazine, toughest article for a young journalist to write is a positive article about a politician. And yet, politicians keep on coming up with some really good ideas. They're complicated. They don't involve Kim Kardashian. But I can name, 5 or 10 people in both parties, in each party, who are really interested in the public good. We could get more of them if more of us were interested, and if more of us journalists stop being so desperate, which we obviously are at this point. But even as this little thing lights up with constant emails from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee over the last 4 or 5 days, constant begging, the president's going to be impeached. Joe, you haven't chipped in. How many of you get these emails? You get them, right? Yeah. Isn't it disgraceful? It makes me want to take one of those Viking River cruises, But despite all that, I'm optimistic. And I'm optimistic because of the kids I met in the military, because I've seen the model. I've seen that service creates citizens. I've seen it. I've seen it with a lot of kids, my kids' age, who weren't in the military. My youngest son is a social worker. My oldest son is a diplomat. I am optimistic because of them and because of these wonderful young men and women who I've spent the last 3 or 4 years with, and because I'm an American, and that's what we do, optimism. Thanks. And now, having completed my few brief remarks, I'll be happy to take your questions. And it could be about anything from primary colors to Hillary Clinton to whether or not Head Start should be defunded. Yes?
Thank you very much, Joe. Because you're so enthusiastic about what military does to people and service, I've talked to a number of people who came back and were very disappointed because they spent so much energy, they basically gave so much, but they were cynical about top demands, about politicians who were basically giving them the instructions, and also what they reached in real life. They worked so hard and they see everything collapsing. What do you think the influence of that process is on their servants?
Well, I think that, as I said, there are a lot of people who came back damaged, and these were 2 pretty awful wars. Iraq was a disaster from from the jump. Afghanistan was prosecuted in ways that, I thought Afghanistan was just going to be a special ops war. We wouldn't send many troops there. We'd send some special operators who would go into those mountains, dig out the Al-Qaeda people, and, possibly Osama bin Laden, and then they would come home. But it turned into something else entirely because you had a group of people around Bush who thought the war still was a state-to-state proposition. And believe me, there are times when I get shaky with rage when I see Dick Cheney in public pretending to be something other than someone who should spend the rest of his life emptying bedpans at Walter Reed. And there are a lot of veterans who aren't getting hired, as I said. But I think there are answers as well. Far too often, the greatest crime that my profession, it's not a profession, it's more like a dodge, but the greatest crime that journalism has committed is that we only tell you the bad news. And you seem to only want to hear the bad news. And about Kim Kardashian. And I got to tell you that I've met them. There are lots and lots of young veterans who are coming home quietly, serving as firefighters and football coaches and teaching. A number of them gone in to teach for America. And I'll put my chips on them, even though there are so many who've had to fight these wars that should never have happened, these disgraceful wars. Thank you. Yeah.
Joe, you briefly touched on it, but tell us if there's anything that can be done about the cesspool of money in Washington.
No. I was, when I was writing this book, I took a fellowship at the Kennedy School last fall, and Floyd Abrams, the great civil liberties lawyer, came and gave a really fascinating speech about the difference between Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, which I could go into at some other point, but there really is a major difference between the two. And troublemaker that I am, I got up afterwards and asked him a question. I said, you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying that Citizens United was correctly decided. That was about 2-3 years ago. And I said, given what we've seen since with these super PACs and everything, do you stand by that? And he said, absolutely, it was correctly decided. There's nothing you can do about it. It is law. If Floyd Abrams, the leading civil liberties lawyer in this country, believes that, I think the rest of us are going to have to go with it. And I've seen the principle work, what I'm talking about. Money means less in presidential campaigns than it means in any other campaigns because more people are paying attention. Bill Clinton should have been a bonanza for George Bush in 1992. This is a guy who admitted that he put AstroTurf in the back of his pickup truck and then kind of laughed and said, but it wasn't for what you think it was. Actually, my theory is that Clinton was so popular with the working class because he ate at McDonald's, he messed around with lounge singers, and he was kind of living the life, and he cared about them. But I think that the only antidote to money in politics is citizenship. I'm sorry to have to say that. I wish there was some kind of magic bullet, but there isn't. Yes?
You mentioned that within a few minutes of talking to someone, you can tell whether they were Fox News or MSNBC, which I think is a hard recognition of the lack of good debate in this country. And I'm wondering what you think we can do to get back to critical thinking and critical debate and stopping the emotional parody of the pundits.
Well, the question is whether we can get back to some kind of serious debate in this country and get away from, John McLaughlin saying wrong, and there's a whole generation of kids who believe that serious debate is Pat Buchanan and Eleanor Clift screaming at each other. That's another thing that we're responsible for. And I'm going to sound like a broken record after this question and answer period is through, but citizens actually demand it. Real citizens really want to listen to stuff. When you get a serious, tight issue in a community, and you get a town hall, especially in New England, town hall and a crowd like this debating something to do with sewage, you get a serious debate. I just wish we could have a serious debate before we go off and blow up our children in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes?
A number of journalists have mentioned that in the Middle East we have begun a 30 years war, perhaps a holy war. Being an optimist, do you agree or disagree with that assessment?
I agree. I'm not an optimist about them. The question is whether we're at the beginning of a 30 years war in the Middle East. And here's the way I look at it. And in fact, I'll repeat all the questions because people in the back aren't hearing. Every time you see a straight line border in the Middle East, you think it's actually a border? You think that the people who live there drew that border? Or was it Sykes and Picot in 1916 when they divided the Middle East between England and France? The English were particularly, Afghanistan. Some British guy named Durand drew a line over the top of the Hindu Kush that separated Pashtunistan, part of which is in Pakistan, part of which is in Afghanistan. I know, having been in Pashtunistan, that it's a real country. I don't think Pakistan is. I think Pakistan's the most dangerous place in the world. It's 5 different ethnic groups. The very name is an acronym. Punjab, Sindh, I forget what the K was. And it's a place that has had revolutions, coups by Islamic extremists, and it has over 100 nuclear weapons. I am far more concerned about Pakistan than I am about Iran. But to go back to the 30 Years' War, as I said, Iraq isn't a country. Gertrude Bell and Winston Churchill pretended it was a country because they wanted to add the Kurdish oil to the oil down in the south. I'm not so sure that Jordan is a country, sadly, because it's one of the most decent places. Syria is a place, but it's not a country. We're going to see the Sunnis and the Shiites fight each other to the death over these very bloody borders and territories, for them, maybe 30 years. The one mitigating factor is that all the kids have things like this. And there's a way to talk to each other and educate each other, and also go to war with each other. But I think that the information revolution and the new technology will make it easier for people to see just how horrible war is, and might lead them to start thinking about why the rest of the world is moving on and they're still back in medieval times. So, and that's another reason why our kind of neo-colonial efforts to intervene in places like Libya, which is now a complete anarchy, state of anarchy, why our neo-colonial efforts will always fail, because those folks are sick of us coming in and telling them what their borders are and taxing them and, killing them. So to my mind, if it makes those places actual countries that are actually responsible, which no guarantee, then I will be optimistic. But we're going to go through a very rough patch. Yes?
so highly of David Petraeus, I wonder what your reaction was when his career was brought down by, of all things, a sex scandal. Taking that even further, do you consider infidelity to be a career-ending offense for public officials?
It sure was for Bill Clinton. Look, he was in uniform, she was in uniform. They say that the affair began after they both left uniform. If it had occurred while they were in uniform, it would have been a court-martialable offense. And look, Petraeus is a national asset. He can teach us an awful lot about how to train young people, how to make our schools better. He can do a lot of things. He's been kind of shy about doing it. I've talked to him a number of times. He's now on the board of advisors, somehow coincidentally, of both the groups that I'm writing about. I think eventually he should be able to return. And so should Paula Broadwell, who is a very smart woman who went a little love crazy. Was a graduate of the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I know she does great work for veterans in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she lives. But she's the one in our incredibly non-sexist society, she's the one who pays the ultimate price. Okay, I'm trying to go back and forth. We sat next to each other at dinner, so I guess I have to.
So you've already said that there's no silver bullet to get the money out of politics, but recently in the news there's been Larry Lessig with his silver bullet called the Mayday Fund. Did you speculate on why that's not going to work?
Yeah, because we don't have enough citizens yet. I mean, I really like Larry. He's a smart and decent guy. And a lot of the other people who are joining up with him are smart and decent as well. But it's very hard to be, I'm optimistic, but I'm not idealistic, particularly about politics. And what? The question was Larry Lessig's Mayday Fund, which is trying to do a lot of advertising to try to get advertising out of politics. Well, you know, that's the way vaccines work, right? It's not impossible, but I still don't think we have enough citizens to make that happen. And by citizens, I mean people who are actively involved in the issues that face us as a national community. I want to go over to this side. Yeah. I'll come back to you.
There was a lot of excitement surrounding the election of President Obama. I want to know, as that campaign was going on, did you find yourself getting more positive about potential resurrection of goodness in American politics? And now we are where we are. I'm wondering how your opinion has changed, if at all.
Well, the question is about President Obama, and did he make me more optimistic? And how do I feel about him now? I was optimistic. I didn't know which way he was going to go in office. I thought I had had some really interesting conversations with him over the years, and I knew him, sorry, Rush Limbaugh, to be a real moderate. I consider myself a flaming moderate, by the way. That will be, if I write memoirs, it will be called Flaming Moderate. But I've been disappointed in him. I think he's done a lot of the big stuff right. He hasn't gotten us involved into another Iraq, and he could have in Syria. I think that the health care plan, which I've supported ever since it came out of the Heritage Foundation in the late 1980s, In fact, Hillary Clinton really didn't like the fact that I supported the Republican plan in 1992, which was an individual mandate plan. And I supported it when Mitt Romney brought it to Massachusetts. And it was really hilarious for me to see people like Newt Gingrich, who also supported it, now calling it socialism. Here's what disappoints me about Obama. In this era where Republicans have become so nihilistic, Democrats have to think a lot more than they've traditionally thought about governing. Traditionally, Democrats would initiate programs like the war on poverty, and then Republicans like Richard Nixon would come in and figure out how to manage it. Now, Republicans don't want to manage government, they want to destroy it. And Democrats have to really think hard as they propose things like health care about how they're going to manage it. And the problem is that this is an issue that bores the public to tears, but is absolutely crucial. And at the heart of it is a basic rule. There is no creative destruction in government. Regulations pile up in sedimentary layers generation after generation to the point where, you can't go to the bathroom without there being some, in a public place without there being some set of regulations. You cannot have an effective government unless you have accountability. And while I believe government employees have the right to organize, they do not have the right to exist unjudged, unaccountable. I've seen it at the VA. I was the first one to call for Shinseki to resign. But what I really argued with the president about was whether or not he should try and do a demonstration project to lift the civil service laws at the VA so that people could be fired. I mean, civil service laws were great when they were implemented in 1883 by Chester Alan Arthur. I mean, people like Abraham Lincoln were giving post offices to people. You saw the movie, right? But in a bureaucracy this large, if there's no accountability, there will be no effective government. And this is a tough one that Democrats are going to have to swallow because it involves their most prized constituency, the public employees unions. So that's why I'm a flaming moderate. But I truly believe that the president understands this but hasn't acted on it. And more importantly, he hasn't led. A couple of weeks ago, I was down on the border at this Catholic Charities reception center, a place for people who actually had family here to come as they were making the transition from those detention facilities that you've seen on TV and getting on buses. And it was an amazing place. It was a place where God dwelled. It was a place where these desperate, terrified people, mothers and kids, could go and get clothing. There were all these piles of clothing according to size. Get a meal from Save the Children. Take a shower. And the most amazing thing was that when they walked in, when the families walked in, the volunteers, and there were hundreds of them, would stop and applaud. Thank you. Congratulations for coming here. Because you hear the stories, and you see the mother with the machete scar across her hand, who got it trying to defend her 12-year-old daughter from being raped. I mean, 12-year-old is the cutoff point. They try and get their kids out of there before then because the boys are pressed into gangs and the girls are raped and pressed into prostitution or whatever, moving drugs. And they make it across the desert and they're applauded. And they cry. And everybody else does too. And I think that if the President of the United States really wanted to lead, if he really wanted to dramatize what was happening, he should go there. He shouldn't just go to places where people agree with him. He shouldn't just give speeches where people agree with him. He should do what Bobby Kennedy did on that night in 1968. He should go to Tea Party meetings. I mean, I've seen Obama at his best when he goes into the Lion's Den. He did it after the 2010 election, I think you may remember, and argued with the Republican members of Congress and got the better of them. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't lead. And so while I still like the guy and I still feel safe with him as being my president, and I think that, and I'm proud that he's my president, I think that he has been a disappointment in that way. Over this side, are we? One more. I'll take my Penn classmate.
Most of the people in this room get their news from print newspapers.
Thank God. There are still a few of you.
And most of our children get their news from something like this. And community newspapers in most cases are dying for lack of advertising. I wonder if you can just talk about the future of the media and how it's changing and why you're optimistic about it.
You know, I spent the last year on book leave at Harvard and at Oxford and Cape Cod, and I came back to the magazine a couple of months ago, and there have been all these changes done to the website. So I'm kind of having trouble keeping up with the present of journalism, much to say nothing of the future. I'm kind of glad that I am, I guess, reaching the end of my career rather than starting it, because my biggest fear is that there aren't going to be the resources, because we haven't figured out a way to pay for online journalism. There isn't enough online advertising out there to pay. There's enough to pay for kids, and we got a bunch of them at time.com now, who aggregate stuff from around the web and you know, and do that rather than go out and report. I'm really frightened about how we're going to get information in the future. You know, there are a lot of really interesting places you can find on the web where people are just doing ad hoc, amateur reporting of what they're seeing. But I don't think that that gets to a mass. I mean, it's more of this cascading libertarianism. If you want to have a community, you have to have a town square. And in our lifetimes, that town square was the local newspaper, the 3 networks. Remember, there were only 3 flavors of ice cream, except for Howard Johnson, too. And my big concern, you know, as I've said tonight, and this is a good way to end it, is that for democracy to work, it can only work in the context of a community. The founding principle of this country was brilliantly that the things that we had in common, no matter what we looked like, no matter what our religion was, no matter where we came from, the things that we had in common were more important than the things that divided us. That has kind of fallen to marketing. If this is the golden age of anything, it's the golden age of marketing. And marketing is the exact opposite of our founding principle, which is you sell to the differences. You sell to the niche. My dad was a member of the we re-tribalized. My dad was a member of the ESPN tribe. My daughter's a member of the MTV tribe. I'm obviously a member of the CNN C-SPAN tribe. And to me, that is the greatest question, along with how are we going to provide really good middle-class jobs in the future. But I really believe that democracy cannot exist without a sense of community. And I do believe that virtual community is an oxymoron. So, I mean, this is a very old-fashioned message I've delivered to you tonight. You know, I want us to get back together. I want our kids to lead it. I kind of think they will. I hope they will. But I'm pretty concerned about it. Thank you all very much.